What if the greatest cultural rebirths in history weren't born from genius or inspiration, but from theft? Picture a sacred relic, shimmering with centuries of devotion, suddenly vanishing in the dead of night. The shockwaves of its disappearance ripple far beyond the walls of a temple or monastery, igniting something unexpected, a fire of creativity, a hunger for identity, a renaissance no one could have predicted. This isn't just the stuff of legends, it's history's best-kept secret. Across the medieval world, stolen relics didn't just leave voids in their wake. They sparked movements that redefined art, faith, and even entire nations. Think about the power of an object so revered that its absence could move thousands to action. A saint's bones, smuggled away under cover of darkness, might inspire a wave of breathtaking frescoes as communities sought to fill the spiritual gap. A stolen religious icon could unite a fractured people under a shared cause, birthing new traditions that lasted centuries. These weren't mere crimes, they were catalysts, turning points where loss became the soil for something extraordinary to grow. And the most astonishing part, many of these stolen treasures were never recovered, yet their legends lived on, shaping cultures in ways their original thieves could never have imagined. So how did these acts of theft rewrite history? Why did the absence of these objects stir such profound change? From the shadowy corners of medieval Europe to the bustling markets of the Silk Road, we're about to unravel 25 astonishing stories of relics that vanished only to return as symbols of something far greater. Some sparked artistic revolutions, others revived forgotten languages, and a few even rekindled the flames of national pride. This isn't just a tale of missing treasures, it's a journey into the heart of human resilience, where the darkest losses gave birth to the brightest rebirths. Ready to uncover the hidden legacies of history's most transformative thefts? Let's begin. Among the most legendary relics to vanish during the medieval era, the Holy Lance of Antioch holds a place of startling significance. Believed to be the very spear that pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion, its sudden disappearance during the chaos of the First Crusade sent shockwaves through Christendom. But rather than fading into obscurity, its absence became the spark for something far greater, a cultural reawakening that reshaped medieval Europe. Without the physical object to venerate, artists and writers rushed to fill the void, immortalizing the lance in breathtaking stained glass, illuminated manuscripts, and epic poems that celebrated its divine power. The legend of the lance grew wilder with each retelling. Some claimed it glowed with unearthly light, others whispered it could turn the tide of battles single-handedly. These tales didn't just entertain, they inspired. The sudden gap left by the stolen relic ignited a fervor for sacred objects, leading churches to commission lavish reliquaries designed to house fragments of saints and martyrs. Goldsmiths and enamelers flourished, crafting intricate containers worthy of heaven's touch. Even the knights of Europe embraced the lance's myth, weaving its story into the code of chivalry, where honor and divine purpose became inseparable. But here's the twist: the lance's theft didn't weaken faith, it amplified it. Without the relic itself, its legend became untouchable, free to evolve beyond the limits of a physical object. Pilgrims still traveled to Antioch, not to see the lance, but to stand where it had once been, to feel the echo of its power. The very act of seeking, of believing in something just out of reach, became a kind of devotion. And in that space between loss and longing, medieval culture found new ways to express the inexpressible, turning absence into a wellspring of creativity that would endure for centuries. What's remarkable is how a single act of theft didn't just steal an artifact, it unlocked an entire era's imagination. The Holy Lance's disappearance forced medieval society to confront a profound question. When the sacred is taken from you, how do you keep it alive? Their answer, through art, through story, through the unshakable belief that some things are too powerful to ever truly be lost. And in that answer, we see the birth of a cultural renaissance forged not in possession, but in yearning. The Crown of Thorns was no ordinary holy relic. It was a sacred paradox, a symbol of suffering that became a beacon of hope. When French knights seized it from Constantinople in the 13th century during the Fourth Crusade, they carried away more than a twisted circlet of brambles. They ignited a cultural firestorm that would reshape medieval France. King Louis IX, later canonized as Saint Louis, didn't just acquire a relic, he inherited a spiritual revolution. To house this divine prize, he commissioned Saint Chapelle, a masterpiece of Gothic architecture so radiant it was called a gateway to heaven. Its stained glass windows, glowing like jewels in sunlight, weren't mere decoration, they were theology in color, telling the story of salvation with a brilliance that left pilgrims breathless. But the crown's impact stretched far beyond stone and glass. Its arrival in Paris transformed the city into a magnet for the devout and the creative. Artists flocked to depict its thorny curves in ivory miniatures and illuminated psalters, while poets wove its legend into verses that blurred the line between prayer and art. Goldsmiths, inspired by the relic's humble majesty, crafted monstrances and chalices that turned altars into stages for the divine. Even the crown's absence from Constantinople had unintended consequences. The Byzantine Empire, stripped of one of its holiest treasures, began reimagining its own sacred art, turning inward to create icons of startling emotional depth. Here's the twist: the theft didn't diminish the crown's power, it multiplied it. By moving from the hushed sanctuaries of the East to the bustling heart of Paris, the relic became a living force in everyday life. Markets sold pewter pilgrim badges stamped with its image, while mystery plays reenacted Christ's passion with the crown as their climax. Louis himself walked barefoot through the streets to install it in Saint Chapelle, turning politics into pageantry and kingship into sacred theater. The message was clear: this wasn't just a king's treasure, it was a people's relic, a shared touchstone that welded faith and national identity into one. And perhaps most remarkably, the crown's journey reveals how theft could birth beauty. The same hands that looted Constantinople unwittingly sparked an artistic renaissance, one where light, color, and stone conspired to lift the human spirit. Saint Chapelle's vaulted ceilings didn't just shelter a relic, they whispered a truth medieval Europe was only beginning to grasp: that sometimes what's stolen isn't lost but transformed. The Crown of Thorns, meant to humble kings, had instead crowned a city with glory, proving that even history's darkest acts could scatter seeds of renewal. The Black Madonna of Czestochowa wasn't just a painting, it was a battlefield. When invaders stormed the Jasna Gora monastery in the 15th century, slashing the icon's face with swords and leaving it for ruined, they didn't realize they were forging a legend. The miracle wasn't just that the icon survived, it was how its scars became a mirror for Poland itself, beaten but unbroken. Returned to its place of honor, the Madonna's darkened visage, marked by gashes that seemed to weep, transformed into a symbol of resistance. Artists across the countryside began recreating her image in vibrant folk paintings, each brushstroke a quiet act of defiance. Woodcarvers chiseled her likeness into roadside shrines, turning humble villages into galleries of national pride. But the Madonna's influence reached far beyond visual art. Poets and chroniclers, gripped by her story, wove her into ballads that blurred the lines between prayer and protest. These weren't mere songs, they were cultural lifelines, preserving the Polish language during eras of foreign rule, when speaking it openly could mean punishment. Even the church embraced her as more than a religious icon. She became a rallying cry, her annual feast days swelling into festivals where traditional embroidery, music, and dance flourished under the banner of faith and identity. The very act of venerating her became a silent rebellion, a way to say we remain without speaking a word. Here's what makes her story extraordinary. The theft and vandalism meant to erase her only magnified her power. Like the lance and the crown before her, the Madonna's absence and her wounded return forced people to confront what they truly valued. Her scars didn't frighten the faithful, they galvanized them. Pilgrims traveled for miles to touch the chapel walls that housed her, leaving behind votives that grew into a folk art tradition of its own. Tiny metal hearts, carved wooden limbs, tokens of gratitude that turned the monastery into a living museum of hope. And perhaps most strikingly, the Madonna's legacy proves how cultural rebirth often springs from the darkest cracks in history. Poland's eras of partition and occupation couldn't suppress the creativity she unleashed. Instead, her image became a secret language of resilience, carried in pocket-sized prayer cards, stitched into baptismal gowns, hummed in lullabies. The thieves who tried to destroy her inadvertently gave Poland something unstealable, a story of survival so potent it outlasted empires. The Black Madonna didn't just return to her altar, she etched herself into the soul of a nation, turning loss into a wellspring of art, faith, and unshakable pride. The Veil of Veronica was said to hold the very face of Christ, imprinted when a compassionate woman wiped his brow on the road to Calvary. But when German mercenaries tore through Rome in 1527, looting churches and burning palaces, the sacred cloth vanished without a trace. What happened next wasn't just a loss, it was an invitation. With no relic to venerate, artists across Europe seized the chance to answer a burning question. What did the divine truly look like? This wasn't mere speculation. It was a theological revolution with a paintbrush. Albrecht Dürer, haunted by the veil's absence, filled sketchbooks with studies of wrinkled fabric, trying to capture how light might have fallen across Christ's features. In Venice, workshops buzzed with debates about whether the true image showed suffering or serenity, leading to a flood of half-length portraits where Jesus gazed directly at the viewer, his expression hovering between sorrow and solace. Even Leonardo da Vinci, ever the skeptic, couldn't resist the challenge. His red chalk studies of bearded men, their eyes heavy with wisdom, may have been private attempts to solve the same holy riddle. But the veil's greatest legacy wasn't in any single masterpiece, it was in the way its disappearance democratized divinity. Without an official image to defer to, painters began blending local faces with sacred ones. A Florentine Christ might have the strong nose of a guild master, a German Madonna, the freckles of the artist's sister. This wasn't heresy, it was intimacy, a way to make the divine feel as close as a neighbor. And as these portraits multiplied, something unexpected happened. Every day people began seeing themselves in the sacred. The twist, the sack of Rome, meant to weaken the church, accidentally gave faith a new language. Where the veil had once been locked away, seen only by priests, its absence set Christ's face free to live in 1,000 forms, on altarpieces, in taverns, even etched into the lids of travel mirrors carried by merchants. The relic's theft didn't erase the holy face, it multiplied it, proving that sometimes loss doesn't destroy, it diffuses. And in that diffusion, Renaissance art found its soul, not in perfect copies, but in the glorious, imperfect attempt to touch the untouchable. The arm of St. Francis Xavier didn't just travel to Asia, it sparked a cultural alchemy no one saw coming. When Portuguese traders smuggled the relic out of Rome in the 16th century, they carried more than a saint's preserved limb, they brought a collision of worlds. Landing in Goa, the arm became a magnet for devotion, but what happened next wasn't mere veneration, it was a revolution in art. Local sculptors, accustomed to carving Hindu deities with fluid grace, suddenly found themselves reimagining Christian saints. The result, statues where Saint Anthony stood draped in dhotis, his face bearing the serene smile of a bodhisattva, while the Virgin Mary's robes flowed with the delicate pleats of a classical Bharatanatyam dancer. This wasn't imitation, it was reinvention. Churches rose with facades that twisted European Gothic arches into lotus blossoms, their altars inlaid with mother-of-pearl in patterns borrowed from Mughal palaces. Even the relic itself became part of the fusion. The arm's silver reliquary, crafted by Goan silversmiths, shimmered with motifs of palm trees and coconuts, saints perched atop elephants instead of lions. The Portuguese might have brought the relic, but the people of Goa gave it a new language, one where incense coiled around censers shaped like temple bells, and frescoes of the Last Supper showed disciples seated on woven floor mats, sharing curry on banana leaves. Yet the arm's true power lay in its unintended diplomacy. Forced conversions had sown resentment, but the art born from this stolen relic became a silent bridge. Hindu artisans found pride in chiseling marble angels with the same hands that carved Durga, while Christian congregations embraced altar pieces where peacocks, sacred in both traditions, fanned their tails behind the crucifix. The relic's theft had ripped it from one context, but in Goa it became something transcendent, a testament to how beauty could grow in the unlikeliest soil. And here's the paradox: the arm's journey, born of colonial greed, accidentally gave rise to a style that defied domination. The Indo-Portuguese aesthetic wasn't just decorative, it was defiant, a visual dialect that said cultures could converse without conquering. Today, the arm still rests in Goa's Basilica of Bom Jesus, but its legacy lies in every hybrid curve of the churches it inspired. What began as theft became an unexpected gift, proof that even when relics are taken, they can still give, not just to those who steal them, but to those who remake them into something new. The Stone of Scone wasn't just a rock, it was Scotland's beating heart. When Edward I of England wrenched it from beneath the coronation throne at Scone Abbey in 1296, he didn't just steal a symbol, he ripped open a wound that would bleed poetry for centuries. The stone, whispered to have been Jacob's pillow from the Book of Genesis, had crowned Scottish kings since time out of mind. Its absence left a throne empty in more ways than one. But in that void, something extraordinary stirred, a resurgence of Gaelic verse so potent it became the lifeblood of a nation's defiance. Bards who once sang of kings now turned their tongues to lament. Their poems weren't mere nostalgia, they were maps preserving Scotland's sovereignty in metaphor and metre when it couldn't exist on parchment. Blind Harry's Wallace, an epic of the freedom fighter William Wallace, didn't just recount battles, it weaponized memory, painting the stone's theft as a theft of destiny itself. These verses spread like wildfire through smoky taverns and hidden glens, their rhythms keeping time with the pulse of resistance. Even the stone's nickname, the Stone of Destiny, became a rallying cry, a promise that what was taken could still return. Yet the stone's greatest power lay in its silence. Locked away under England's coronation chair in Westminster, it became an invisible guest at every English crowning, a ghost haunting the very ceremonies meant to erase Scotland's legacy. Artists responded with sly symbolism, illuminated manuscripts bordered with thistles, Scotland's emblem, tucked between vines of English ivy. Tapestries depicted biblical stones tumbling from heaven, their fall mirroring Scotland's hope for the relic's return. The message was clear: a stone might be stolen, but its weight could still tip the scales of history. And then came the irony only time could right. Centuries of poetry had turned the stone into a myth so potent that when it was finally returned to Scotland in 1996, 700 years after its theft, the celebration wasn't just political, it was cultural. Pipers played compositions rooted in those medieval laments, while modern poets penned new verses weaving the stone's journey into Scotland's re-emerging identity. The Relics' homecoming didn't erase the art born from its absence, it consecrated it, proving that sometimes what's stolen doesn't vanish, it grows wings. The bards were right all along. Destiny isn't held in stone, but in the hands of those who refuse to let its story die. The Shroud of Turin's brief vanishing act in the 14th century sparked a mystery that still lingers today. Unlike relics lost forever, its temporary disappearance played a trick on history. Instead of fading from memory, it multiplied. With the original shroud suddenly gone, countless imitations sprang up across Europe, each claiming to be the true burial cloth of Christ. But these weren't just crude copies, they became a mirror reflecting the era's deepest questions about faith, art, and the very nature of divinity. Artists faced an impossible challenge. How do you paint what no one has truly seen? The shroud's ghostly imprint, a negative image of a bearded man's face and body, defied traditional techniques. Painters like Cennino Cennini, author of the famed Il Libro dell'Arte, experimented with layered glazes of egg tempera to mimic its eerie, translucent quality. Others turned to silverpoint, dragging metal styluses across prepared paper to create faint, shimmering lines that echoed the shroud's mysterious markings. These weren't mere exercises, they were breakthroughs, pushing Renaissance art toward realism by forcing creators to study light, shadow, and human anatomy with fresh eyes. Meanwhile, theologians and scientists waged their own battles over the shroud's absence. Was it a divine relic or an elaborate hoax? The debate raged in university halls, with scholars dissecting its weave under candlelight and alchemists testing pigments that could replicate its stains. This collision of faith and inquiry laid unexpected groundwork centuries before carbon dating. The shroud controversy became one of history's first forensic art investigations, blending devotion with empirical curiosity. What emerged from this chaos was something no thief could have predicted. The shroud's brief disappearance didn't weaken its legend, it turned it into a living dialogue. When it resurfaced, the original bore the weight of new scrutiny, while the forgeries took on lives of their own, some venerated as holy objects in their own right, others displayed as cautionary tales about human gullibility. The shroud's journey proves that even temporary loss can ripple through time, turning doubt into creativity and theft into an accidental muse for both science and sacred art. The Emerald Buddha wasn't just carved from gemstone, it carried the weight of kingdoms in its jade-green gaze. When General Keo Freya Chakri, the future King Rama I of Siam, seized the statue from Laos in 1779, he didn't just plunder a treasure, he ignited an artistic revolution that would redefine an entire nation. The Buddha's journey to Bangkok wasn't merely a transfer of ownership, it was a cultural lightning strike, sparking a renaissance in Thai craftsmanship that still dazzles the world today. To house this sacred prize, Rama commissioned Wat Phra Kieu, the Temple of the Emerald Buddha, a masterpiece so intricate it seemed woven from starlight. But here's the twist, the temple wasn't just a reliquary, it became a living school of art. Stucco artisans, inspired by the Buddha's serene presence, perfected the delicate art of lacquered gold leaf, turning temple walls into shimmering tapestries. Wood carvers, once limited to utilitarian designs, now chiseled celestial beings with such lifelike grace that visitors swore they saw the figures breathe. Even the humble craft of mosaic work transformed overnight, as craftsmen pieced together millions of glass fragments to create murals that glowed like stained fire when the sun struck them. Yet the Buddha's influence stretched far beyond architecture. Its arrival coincided with a golden age of Thai literature, as poets penned verses comparing the statue's glow to the enlightenment of the mind. Dance troupes, inspired by its tranquil expression, refined the subtle gestures of classical Thai ballet, turning religious devotion into movement. Even the statue's seasonal wardrobe changes, where monks draped it in robes of gold for summer, monsoons, and winter, became a ceremonial art form, with each garment embroidered with symbols so precise they told silent sermons in thread. What makes this theft so extraordinary is how it turned conquest into creativity. The Emerald Buddha, meant to symbolize Lao sovereignty, became the beating heart of Thai identity, not through force but through beauty. Its presence didn't erase the past. It wove Laos and Siam into a shared artistic language, where the curves of a temple eve might echo the Mekong's flow, or a mural's color palette pay homage to the jungles of both lands. The statue's theft was a wound, but its legacy became a bridge, proof that even acts of appropriation can't stifle the universal human urge to create, to honor, and to transcend. Wat Phra Kieu stands today not just as a monument to a stolen relic, but to the unbreakable truth that art, once unleashed, belongs to no one and everyone all at once. The Codex Calixtinus wasn't just a book, it was the beating heart of the Camino de Santiago, a 12th century guide so vital that pilgrims once carried fragments of its pages as sacred talismans. When it vanished from the cathedral archives in 2011, the theft felt like a robbery of memory itself. But in its absence, something unexpected unfolded. A wave of modern pilgrims began retracing ancient routes not just with backpacks but with pens. Travel memoirs exploded, each author trying to reconstruct the Codex's magic through personal journeys. Historians pored over digitized fragments, while calligraphers, desperate to preserve its legacy, revived long-forgotten techniques of medieval script. The very act of losing the Codex had somehow rewritten its importance, turning it from a relic behind glass into a living invitation to rediscover the past. What made this manuscript so irresistible? Its pages were a time capsule of the medieval mind, part travelogue, part miracle collection, part musical anthology. It detailed where to find clean water, which innkeepers were honest, and how to avoid bandits on the road to Santiago. But when it disappeared, modern pilgrims found themselves stepping into the Codex Chinese letter, piecing together its wisdom through trial and error. Bloggers became the new scribes, documenting their Camino experiences with the same meticulous care as the original authors. YouTube channels sprouted up, teaching viewers how to navigate the route's hidden trials, from deciphering scallop shell markers to finding the best pulpo afera in Galicia. The Codex's theft didn't erase the Camino's lore, it democratized it, turning every traveler into a potential chronicler. Then came the twist no one anticipated, its recovery. Found stashed in a garage just a year later, the Codex's return should have closed the chapter. Instead, it ignited a global fascination with the physicality of medieval books. Suddenly, museums couldn't keep up with demand for exhibitions on parchment making and iron gall ink. Workshops on Carolingian minuscule script sold out within hours. Even the Codex's flaws, water stains, wormholes, the faint smell of centuries became objects of reverence, proof that beauty survives time's rough hands. Calligraphers began incorporating its distinctive red initials into modern fonts, while musicians reconstructed its polyphonic hymns, giving voice to melodies silent for 800 years. The real miracle, the theft, revealed how much we still need tangible connections to history. In an age of e-books and instant information, The Codex's parchment pages reminded us that some knowledge demands to be touched, pondered, even pilgrimaged toward. Its story proves that sometimes to truly see a treasure, you must first lose it, and then, in the searching, discover how many others have been longing to find it too. The Codex Calixtinus didn't just return to its shelf, it returned the world to a way of seeing where every stroke of ink, every footstep on the Camino, becomes part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the Middle Ages and forward into whatever we dare to create next. The golden sheen of the Reliquary of Saint Foy hid an irony darker than the soot of the French Revolution. Its beauty made it a target. When revolutionaries stormed the Abbey of Conques in 1791, melting down sacred objects to fund their New World Order, the 9th century masterpiece seemed doomed. But this wasn't just another relic lost to history's furnace. Hidden by a sympathetic art scholar who swapped the golden statue with a gilded copy, the real Saint Foy survived, waiting in a farmer's hayloft like a seed beneath winter snow. And when it finally re-emerged decades later, it didn't just return to its altar. It resurrected an entire artistic movement hungry for the past. What made this reliquary so transformative? Its survival became a taunt to the industrial age. Here was no mass-produced trinket, but a work of hammered gold and gemstones so intricate that modern jewelers struggled to comprehend its techniques. The saint's wide-eyed visage, crafted with Byzantine solemnity, stared down the steam-powered factories of 19th century Europe, challenging artists to reclaim hands-on craftsmanship. Workshops from Paris to Munich began experimenting with lost wax casting and cloisonné enameling, techniques not seen since the Middle Ages. Even the reliquary's imperfections, the slight asymmetry of its filigree, the uneven lapis lazuli inlays became virtues in an era starved for authenticity. But the real revolution happened in the shadows of museums. Curators, inspired by Saint Foy's return, began scouring Europe for other, barbaric medieval works once dismissed as crude. Suddenly, Romanesque carvings with their elongated saints and almond-eyed angels were hailed as avant-garde. Architects like Eugene Viollet-le-Duc studied the reliquary's jeweled throne to design Gothic revival cathedrals, while William Morris's arts and crafts movement drew direct lines from Saint Foy's hand-chased details to their manifesto against machine-made soullessness. The relic's journey from hayloft to pedestal proved that beauty could outlast empires, and that sometimes progress means circling back. Yet the most enduring legacy might be how Saint Foy's story redefined cultural theft. Unlike looted relics that vanished forever, her return forced France to confront what revolutions truly destroy. The same nation that once melted crowns for bullion now sent experts to painstakingly restore the reliquary's missing gems, stitch by golden stitch. In doing so, they unwittingly birthed modern conservation science, proving that even acts of vandalism can't erase humanity's need to repair what's broken. Today, pilgrims still flock to Conques, not just to venerate a saint, but to witness a miracle no less profound, the moment a stolen past became a shared future. The Mandillion of Edessa wasn't just a holy image, it was a divine paradox, a portrait whispered to have been created when Christ pressed his face onto a cloth, leaving behind an imprint no human hand could replicate. When this sacred linen vanished during the chaos of the Crusades, it left more than an empty reliquary. It ignited a creative firestorm across Byzantium. Without the physical object to venerate, icon painters faced a daunting challenge. How do you capture the uncapturable? The answer transformed art history. Artisans began experimenting with techniques that would make their icons feel alive, layering translucent washes of egg tempera to mimic the Mandillion's faint, ghostly impression. Gold leaf, once used sparingly, now cascaded across panels like sunlight, suggesting divinity rather than depicting it. the subtlety was revolutionary. Where Western art chased realism, Byzantine masters embraced abstraction, using elongated fingers and almond-shaped eyes to convey spiritual weight rather than physical accuracy. The Mandillion's absence didn't stifle creativity, it liberated it, pushing artists to suggest the sacred through shadow and symbol rather than blunt representation. But the Mandillion's influence stretched far beyond technique. Its legend that it was acheiropoieta, not made by human hands, became theological fuel for the entire concept of icons. Theologians argued that if Christ could leave his image spontaneously, then paintings inspired by him carried a spark of that same divine touch. This wasn't just art, it was communion. Churches that once housed the Mandillion began commissioning triptychs where the central panel intentionally mimicked its lost composition, reinforcing the idea that every icon was a window to heaven, not merely a depiction. The ripple effects were astonishing. Mossaicists in Ravenna adapted the Mandillion's ethereal style, covering domes with countless tesserae that shimmered like cloth in candlelight. Hymnographers composed kontakia elaborate poetic sermons comparing the soul's journey to the slow revelation of an image emerging on linen. Even the iconoclasts who later condemned religious imagery couldn't erase the Mandillion's legacy, as its myth had already rooted the sacredness of art deep into Eastern Christian thought. Here's the twist: the Mandillion's theft didn't erase its power, it universalized it. No longer confined to one piece of cloth, its essence multiplied in thousands of icons, each carrying forward the idea that divinity could imprint itself on the world in unexpected ways. Today, when we stand before a Byzantine icon and feel the weight of those solemn eyes, we're witnessing the unintended gift of a theft, an art form that learned to thrive not by possessing the sacred, but by reaching for it. The Sword of Mohammed wasn't merely a weapon, it was a celestial bridge between earth and heaven, its curved blade said to have been forged from a meteorite's iron. When Mongol horsemen swept through Baghdad in 1258, leaving libraries aflame and palaces in ruins, the sword's disappearance struck a wound deeper than any battlefield loss. But in its absence, something extraordinary unfolded. A renaissance of Islamic artistry that transformed grief into gold. Calligraphers, once content to ink Quranic verses in stark black, now chased the sword's elusive elegance through swirling thuluth script, each stroke mimicking the curve of a blade never seen but never forgotten. Metal workers, denied the original, competed to craft ceremonial swords so ornate they became verses in steel damascene patterns swirling like divine breath, hilts inlaid with lapis lazuli to echo the night sky from which the meteorite had fallen. These weren't replicas, they were revelations, each one a meditation on loss and what endures beyond steel. Poets, however, wielded the sharpest reinterpretations. Rumi, writing in the shadow of the Mongol devastation, spun the missing sword into allegory. The true weapon is not what hangs at the belt, but what flashes in the heart. His contemporary, Sadi of Shiraz, went further, penning couplets where the vanished blade became a test of faith. Do you mourn the sword's passing or the strength it symbolized? The answer reshaped Sufi thought, turning physical absence into a gateway for spiritual presence. Yet the most unexpected legacy bloomed in book arts. Persian miniaturists, unable to depict the prophet's sword directly, devised a cunning visual code. They painted empty scabbards suspended in midair, glowing with unearthly light. Surrounding them, they crowded scenes of scholars and saints, their hands busy with pens rather than weapons. The message was unmistakable. What the Mongols couldn't loot was the creativity they'd unwittingly unleashed. Centuries later, the sword's influence still shimmers. The same Damascene techniques birthed in its absence now adorn mosque gates from Istanbul to Isfahan. while contemporary Muslim artists cite its story as proof that heritage isn't held in objects, but in the hands that reimagine them. The Mongols stole a sword, but they gifted Islam something far more enduring, a lesson that true power lies not in what's taken, but in what's transformed. The Gutenberg Bible wasn't just a book, it was a revolution bound in vellum, the first major work printed with movable type in the 15th century. But when thieves began stealing copies from European libraries in the 1800s, they didn't just take pages, they exposed a cultural blind spot. The world had nearly forgotten Gutenberg's genius until these crimes shocked it back to life. Suddenly, scholars and artisans alike were asking, how had something so transformative become so overlooked? The answer would spark a movement that redefined craftsmanship for the modern age. One stolen copy in particular became the catalyst. Looted from a German monastery in 1843, its absence sent historians scrambling to document surviving editions before more vanished. What they discovered was astonishing, not just the Bible's intricate typography, but the sheer artistry of its production. Gutenberg hadn't just invented printing, he'd elevated it to an art form, with hand-mixed inks that still gleamed after 4 centuries and initials painstakingly illuminated in colors that seemed to pulse on the page. This revelation hit Victorian England like a thunderclap. Artists like William Morris, already disillusioned with industrial mass production, seized on Gutenberg's methods as proof that beauty and mechanics could coexist. The arts and crafts movement was born in those stolen pages, its manifesto clear. Machines might replicate, but only hands could truly create. Printers became detectives, reverse engineering Gutenberg's techniques from the very Bible's thieves had tried to erase. They rediscovered how he'd cast type in lead antimony alloy for durability, how he'd adapted winepress screws to achieve even pressure. But the real breakthrough was philosophical. These artisans realized Gutenberg hadn't just printed a Bible, he'd designed an experience. The spacing between lines, the balance of text to margin, even the faint scent of the ink, every detail conspired to make reading a sacred act. Modern presses couldn't replicate this magic, and suddenly that became the point. What began as thefts ended as tributes. Private collectors who'd once hoisted stolen copies like trophies now funded public facsimiles, allowing museums to display perfect recreations. Typography schools emerged across Europe, teaching Gutenberg's methods not for practicality, but as a form of meditation, each student learning to set type by hand, feeling the weight of history in every leaden letter. Even the stolen Bibles themselves took on new meaning when recovered. Their marginalia, added by generations of readers, became cherished artifacts of how books live through time. The irony is delicious. Thieves trying to profit from Gutenberg's work inadvertently restored its soul, proving that cultural heritage isn't just about preserving objects, it's about reviving the spirit in which they were made. Today, when you see hand-bound books at a boutique press or marvel at a meticulously typeset menu, you're witnessing the afterlife of those 19th century crimes. The Gutenberg Bible didn't just survive its thefts, it returned with a message that some things are too precious to be left to the past, and that sometimes it takes losing something to remember why it mattered. The Spear of Destiny wasn't just a weapon, it was a symphony waiting to be composed. When Napoleon's troops allegedly seized it from Vienna's Hofburg Palace in 1805, they didn't just take a relic rumored to have pierced Christ's side, they unleashed a cultural tempest that would redefine an era. The spear's absence struck a chord deeper than any battlefield defeat, leaving Central Europe scrambling to reclaim not just an artifact, but its very soul. And in that void, artists and musicians found their muse. Richard Wagner, already obsessed with Germanic mythology, became the spear's most unexpected evangelist. His operas, particularly Parsifal, transformed the Relics legend into a soaring allegory, the holy spear as a symbol of purity, lost and redeemed. But here's the twist: Wagner never saw the actual spear. Its absence freed him to reimagine it as a musical motif, a recurring brass fanfare that pierced his compositions like divine intervention. Other composers followed suit, weaving the spear's myth into tone poems and symphonies that resurrected forgotten Teutonic sagas. Suddenly, concert halls became time machines, transporting audiences back to a mythic past that felt more vivid than the present. Yet the spear's influence stretched far beyond opera houses. Painters like Caspar David Friedrich, who'd once focused on serene landscapes, now filled canvases with shadowy knights clutching phantom spears against stormy skies. The Relic's disappearance had turned it into a metaphor for fragmented kingdoms, for spiritual hunger, for the very idea that greatness could be stolen but never erased. Nationalist movements latched onto this imagery, printing the spear's silhouette on pamphlets and protest banners, its silhouette a silent rallying cry for unity. The most ironic twist: Napoleon likely never took the spear at all. Historians now believe it remained hidden in Vienna, its theft a rumor that spiraled out of control. But the legend proved more potent than the truth. By the time the spear resurfaced, it had already birthed an artistic movement that blended medieval mysticism with modern nationalism. Wagner's operas, Friedrich's haunting vistas, even the Gothic typography of revolutionary broadsheets, all bore the invisible mark of a relic that never really left, but instead lived on in the creative fire of those who believed it was gone. The spear of destiny's true power wasn't in its blade, but in its absence, a blank space that an entire generation filled with music, paint, and dreams of a world reborn. The Cloak of St. Martin wasn't just fabric, it was a revolution waiting to unfold. When Protestant reformers stripped it from its shrine in Tours during the 16th century, they didn't just steal a relic, they tore a hole in the visual language of French devotion. But in that emptiness, something remarkable took root. Across the Loire Valley, weavers who had spent generations copying Flemish designs suddenly found themselves reaching back to an older tradition, one where every thread told a story. The cloak's absence became a summons, urging artisans to recreate its legend not in silver or stone, but in the very medium it had been taken from, the loom. What emerged from this crisis was nothing short of a textile renaissance. Tapestry workshops, once relegated to producing courtly hunting scenes, now turned their warp and weft to St. Martin's most famous act the moment he sliced his military cloak in half to shelter a freezing beggar. But here's the twist: these weren't mere illustrations. Weavers embedded the story's essence into their craft, using techniques lost since the Middle Ages. The beggar's tattered robe might be rendered in looped pile stitching, rough to the touch, while Martin's half-cloak shimmered with silk thread wrapped in silver gilt. Viewers didn't just see the charity, they felt it, their fingers tracing the same division between wealth and want that the saint had bridged. The movement spread like wildfire. Nobles who had once prized Italian frescoes now commissioned tapestries as spiritual investments, their walls alive with woolen saints. In Angers, workshops revived the ancient millefleurs style, where Martin's figure stood amid a sea of symbolic blooms: clover for the Trinity, violets for humility, each flower a silent sermon. Even the dyes carried meaning. The deep indigo of Martin's cloak, extracted from woad plants grown in monastic gardens, became known as Bleu de Saint Martin, a shade so vibrant it seemed to glow with divine approval. Yet the cloak's true legacy lay in its paradox. By vanishing, it had given weavers permission to reimagine holiness. A Burgundian workshop might depict Martin as a contemporary nobleman, his sword cutting not just clothes but the chains of serfs. In Lyon, silk weavers, traditionally excluded from religious commissions, created a series where the beggar's face mirrored the weaver's own, a quiet protest against Reformation iconoclasm. The stolen cloak had become a mirror, reflecting not what was lost, but what could still be woven from belief, and perhaps most strikingly, this textile revival outlasted the Reformation storms. When the original cloak was finally returned to Tours centuries later, it found a city where Saint Martin lived not in a single relic, but in 100 tapestries lining cathedral walls, guild halls, and even merchant homes. The theft had accomplished what veneration alone could not. It had turned a saint's story into a shared language, one where every pulled thread and knotted color spoke of generosity's enduring power. The cloak's journey proves that sometimes, to truly clothe a legend in glory, you must first let it go naked into the world. The Buddha's tooth wasn't just a relic, it was the soul of Sri Lanka incarnate. When Portuguese invaders stormed the temple of the sacred tooth in Kandy in the 16th century, spiriting away the molar said to have been plucked from the Buddha's funeral pyre, they didn't just steal an object. They severed a nation's spiritual spine, but what the colonizers couldn't anticipate was how the tooth's eventual return would ignite a cultural fire so bright it would outshine even the darkest days of foreign rule. For decades, the tooth's absence festered like an open wound. Kandyan artisans, once tasked with crafting golden caskets for its veneration, turned their tools to secret resistance, carving hidden lotus motifs into colonial furniture, weaving rebellion into temple textiles with threads dyed in smuggled saffron. Then came the miracle, the relic's dramatic recovery in the 17th century, smuggled back to Kandy in a fisherman's basket, wrapped in nothing but faith. Its homecoming didn't just restore a relic, it resurrected an entire artistic vocabulary. The temples rebuilt to house the tooth became canvases for a defiant new aesthetic. Architects blended traditional Sinhalese moonstones with Dutch gable roofs, creating a hybrid style that whispered, "We adapt, but we endure." Fresco painters, inspired by the tooth's journey, covered walls with scenes from the Jataka tales, not in static gold as before, but in cascading emerald and lapis that seemed to move in lamplight, as if the Buddha himself walked among them. Yet the true Renaissance blossomed in the dance of the Kandyan people. The tooth's return birthed the Vest tradition, where performers channeled its sacred energy through every muscle tremor. Dancers became living reliquaries, their elaborate headdresses mimicking the tooth's casket, their rhythmic footwork echoing the relic's secret journey home. Even the drummer's beats carried coded meaning, the low thrum of the Gota Barea drum symbolizing the Portuguese ships, the answering thunder of the Yak Barea embodying the tooth's triumphant return. What makes this story extraordinary is how a single tooth became a bulwark against cultural erasure. Under British rule centuries later, when colonial officials banned traditional ceremonies, the tooth's guardians responded with sly creativity. They disguised rituals as folk dances, hid sacred chants in nursery rhymes, and even turned the relic's annual procession into a parade that just happened to include every forbidden art form. The tooth, once a passive object of veneration, had become an active participant in resistance, proof that some relics don't just reflect history, they shape it. Today, when you witness the Azala Perahara festival, where elephants parade through Kandy draped in glowing textiles, their tusks gleaming like the returned tooth itself, you're seeing more than a celebration. You're witnessing the afterlife of a theft, a cultural phoenix that rose because it was first forced to burn. The Buddha's tooth didn't just come back to Sri Lanka, it brought Sri Lanka back to itself, one drumbeat, one brushstroke, one sacred dance at a time. Crown jewels of Scotland weren't just regalia, they were a kingdom's heartbeat encased in gold. When Oliver Cromwell's forces seized them in 1651, melting down the crown and scepter to erase Scotland's sovereignty, they didn't realize they were igniting a cultural rebellion fiercer than any battlefield. The jewels' physical destruction could have been the end of a legacy. Instead, their absence became the ink in 1,000 poets' pens, the breath in 100 rebel songs, and the silent roar of a nation refusing to forget. Jacobite bards operating in shadowed glens and smoky taverns turned the lost crown into a living symbol. Their ballads wove cryptic references to the old diadem or the bonny broken circle, metaphors so potent that singing them aloud was an act of treason. One anonymous verse, "The Crownless King," imagined the jewels hidden beneath Loch Leven's waters, their glow guiding loyalists like submerged stars. These weren't just songs, they were maps of resistance, preserving heraldic imagery and royal mottos in melody, long after the originals had been reduced to bullion. Yet the jewels' ghost haunted more than music. Clan chiefs, forbidden from displaying royal crests, commissioned clandestine portraits where the missing crown appeared reflected in a warrior's sword or glimpsed in a stormy sky. Silversmiths, risking imprisonment, fashioned brooches with empty settings where gemstones should have been a wearable protest that spoke louder than words. Even the act of remembering became artistry. Tartan patterns subtly incorporated the crown's silhouette into their weave, while ceilidh dances included a sudden, silent pause where dancers would touch their brows, a mimicry of coronation rites. The irony, Cromwell's attempt to obliterate Scottish identity had the opposite effect. By destroying the physical symbols, he forced the culture to embed them deeper, not in gold, but in story, song, and collective memory. When a replacement set of honors was finally crafted in 1660, they carried the weight of this creative resistance. The new crown's arches bore thistle motifs lifted from Jacobite poetry, while the scepter's design echoed descriptions from outlawed ballads. The jewels weren't restored, they were reborn, forged not just by royal decree but by the people who had kept their essence alive through art. And here's the twist, the thefts didn't end there. Hidden again during the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the honors' repeated disappearances and recoveries turned them into cultural phantoms, always vanishing, always returning, each absence another layer to their legend. Today, when visitors crowd Edinburgh Castle to see the gleaming regalia, they're not just looking at gemstones, they're witnessing the afterlife of loss, a testament to how a nation's soul can never truly be stolen, only temporarily misplaced, waiting for the right song to call it home. The Holy Propus, Christ's foreskin, preserved as a relic, might be history's most uncomfortable sacred object. When thieves snatched it from the Italian town of Calcutta in the 16th century, they didn't just steal a fragment of flesh. They unleashed a storm of satire that would shake the foundations of relic veneration itself. The disappearance of this peculiar artifact became fodder for Renaissance writers like Erasmus, who penned scathing dialogues mocking the absurdity of competing churches, all claiming to possess the one true Propus. But beneath the laughter, something unexpected was stirring. A theological reckoning that would echo through the Reformation. What made this relic so ripe for controversy? Its very existence forced uncomfortable questions. How could multiple shrines boast the same holy foreskin? Why did Christ's circumcision merit veneration at all? The theft didn't just create a vacancy, it exposed the absurdity of a system where relics had become spiritual currency. Reformers like Martin Luther seized on the Propus's disappearance as evidence of the Church's excesses, arguing that true faith needed no physical crutches. But here's the twist. The relic's absence didn't end the debate, it deepened it. Catholic theologians, stung by satire, began refining their doctrines on relics, distinguishing between veneration and worship with newfound precision. The stolen Propus, of all things, had become a catalyst for doctrinal clarity. Artists waded into the fray with sly brilliance. Painters like Lucas Cranach the Elder inserted subtle jabs into religious scenes. A discarded knife in a circumcision tableau, or a shadowy figure slipping away with a cloth visual puns that delighted reformers and infuriated traditionalists. Meanwhile, playwrights staged farces where bumbling thieves tried to sell fake holy foreskins to gullible bishops, turning the relics theft into a mirror for institutional corruption. The Propus's journey from sacred to scandalous revealed a Renaissance truth. Humor could be as sharp as any theologian's quill, yet the most lasting impact was invisible. The debate sparked by this stolen relic forced both sides to confront a fundamental question: where does the sacred truly reside, in objects, in rituals, or in the believer's heart? By the time the Catholic Church quietly discouraged veneration of the Holy Propus in the 19th century, its theft had already done the unthinkable, turning a joke into a meditation on the nature of faith itself. The relic's legacy proves that even history's strangest thefts can leave behind something far more enduring, not a fragment of skin, but a fragment of truth. The Rosetta Stone wasn't just a slab of granite, it was a linguistic key lying dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to unlock an entire civilization's voice. When Napoleon's troops unearthed it in 1799 during their Egyptian campaign, they had no idea they'd stumbled upon the spark that would ignite Europe's obsession with the ancient world. But it was the stone's eventual seizure by the British in 1801 that turned curiosity into a cultural earthquake. Stripped of its original context, this stolen artifact became something far more powerful, a mirror reflecting Europe's own hunger for lost knowledge. What made the Rosetta Stone so revolutionary? Its surface bore the same decree in three scripts: hieroglyphics, Demotic, and Ancient Greek, a trilingual puzzle begging to be solved. For scholars, it was like finding a dictionary buried in the sand. Yet the stone's true magic wasn't just in its inscriptions, but in its absence from Egypt. Displayed in London's British Museum, it became a public spectacle, drawing crowds who marveled at the strange carvings. Artists like Joseph Bonomi sketched its symbols, incorporating them into everything from furniture motifs to theater backdrops. Suddenly, Egyptomania swept through drawing rooms. Sphinxes adorned teacups, obelisks sprouted in private gardens, and ladies' fashion embraced striped Nimes headdresses in satin rather than stone. But the stone's greatest legacy was born from its theft. Without access to the original, French linguist Jean-François Champollion had to work from copies, painstakingly comparing glyphs to Greek words like a detective piecing together a cipher. His eventual breakthrough in 1822 didn't just crack the hieroglyphic code, it birthed modern Egyptology. Museums scrambled to re-examine their collections with fresh eyes, realizing they'd been sitting on storerooms full of mislabeled artifacts. The stone's absence had forced scholars to engage with Egyptian culture on its own terms, not as a cabinet of curiosities, but as a complex civilization begging to be understood. The irony, while the British touted the stone as a trophy of empire, its theft inadvertently democratized Egypt's past. Printing presses churned out reproductions, allowing middle-class families to puzzle over hieroglyphs at their kitchen tables. Children's primers featured cartoon pharaohs speaking in word bubbles filled with rebus-like symbols. Even the stone's physicality, its chipped edges, the way light caught its inscriptions, became part of its legend, inspiring poets to compare it to a shattered mirror slowly being reassembled. Today, the Rosetta Stone's dual legacy endures. It remains a flashpoint in debates over cultural restitution, even as its image has become shorthand for decoding secrets in everything from genetics to computer science. The stone's journey from battlefield spoil to intellectual lodestar proves that sometimes the greatest thefts aren't of objects, but of ignorance, and that a single slab of rock, once stolen, can become the cornerstone of an entire field of human knowledge. The bones of Saint Nicholas weren't just relics, they were the spark that turned a quiet Italian port into the epicenter of a medieval cultural explosion. When sailors from Bari raided the saint's tomb in Myra in 1087, smuggling his remains across the Mediterranean in a daring midnight operation, they weren't just committing theft, they were rewriting history. The moment those bones touched Apulian soil, something extraordinary unfolded. A sleepy coastal town became the beating heart of pilgrimage routes, and an architectural revolution was born from the chaos of holy larceny. Bari's transformation began with sheer necessity, as word spread that the real Saint Nicholas, yes, the gift-giving saint who would inspire Santa Claus, now rested in their city. Pilgrims flooded in by the thousands. But the cramped Byzantine-era churches couldn't handle the crowds. What emerged was the Basilica di San Nicola, a masterpiece of Apulian Romanesque that fused Norman muscle with Byzantine grace. Its soaring arches, supported by columns looted from ancient Roman ruins, whispered a cheeky truth. Even the builders understood that sacred spaces could rise from borrowed glory. The church's most striking feature, a ceiling painted with stars plucked from the night sky, an artistic wink to Nicholas's legendary role as patron saint of sailors. Yet the basilica was just the beginning. The saint's stolen bones demanded processions, and those processions needed grand public spaces. Bari's entire urban layout shifted, with wide new streets radiating from the basilica like spokes on a wheel. Stone carvers, inspired by the saint's tales, adorned doorways with whimsical monsters swallowing their own tails, symbolizing how Nicholas's generosity could tame even the wildest greed. Even the city's economy transformed, as workshops sprang up to craft miniature oil lamps shaped like ships, sold to pilgrims as tokens of safe passage home. But here's the twist: the theft didn't just elevate Bari, it universalized Nicholas himself. In Myra, he'd been a local bishop. In Bari, he became a global phenomenon. Crusaders stopping to venerate his relics carried his stories northward, where Norse skalds blended them with Yule traditions. Dutch settlers in New Amsterdam would later morph Sinterklaas into Santa Claus. Meanwhile, Bari's artisans kept reinventing the saint's image, from stern Byzantine icons to jolly Renaissance frescoes where he tossed coins down chimneys. The merchants who stole a body unwittingly gifted the world a legend, proving that sometimes the greatest acts of theft aren't of objects, but of imagination. And perhaps most beautifully, the bones' journey birthed an enduring paradox. Every year on May 9th, Bari celebrates the translation of Nicholas's relics with a pageant where locals reenact the theft, not as crime, but as divine providence. As the procession winds through streets lined with almond blossom confetti, it's clear what began as sacrilege became sacred, turning pirates into pilgrims and looters into architects of a cultural legacy that still shines in every Christmas light, every child's hopeful stocking, and every stone of Bari's starry vaulted heavens. The Sudarium of Oviedo wasn't just a cloth, it was a riddle wrapped in bloodstains, a relic whispered to have covered Christ's face after the crucifixion. Unlike other sacred objects that vanished forever, this one played a game of hide and seek with history, disappearing and reappearing across centuries like a divine sleight of hand. Each time it vanished, its absence didn't diminish devotion. It deepened the mystery, sparking a creative fire that would illuminate Spain's spiritual landscape for generations. When Moorish armies swept through Iberia in the 8th century, the Sudarium's guardians smuggled it northward, hiding it in caves and mountain chapels. Its very elusiveness became its power. Without a fixed shrine to anchor it, the cloth lived in stories, tales of shepherds stumbling upon it in mist-shrouded valleys, or knights finding it draped over a lone oak like a phantom's shroud. These weren't just legends, they were invitations. Mystics like Saint Theresa of Avila and John of the Cross wove the Sudarium's disappearances into their writings, turning its absences into metaphors for the soul's search for God. The relic's physical scarcity made its spiritual presence palpable, a paradox that fueled an entire genre of contemplative literature. Artists, too, felt its pull. Unable to depict the Sudarium directly, its stains too sacred to replicate, they found oblique ways to honor it. Painters like El Greco inserted veiled references, a crumpled cloth at the foot of the cross, or a shaft of light falling across a saint's face in the exact dimensions of the relic. Sculptors carved altarpieces where the Sudarium's folds seemed to ripple in stone, as if the material remembered its holy burden. Even the bloodstains themselves, their patterns debated by theologians, became a kind of sacred Rorschach test. Viewers saw in them everything from the outline of Jerusalem to the face of the Virgin. Yet the Sudarium's greatest legacy was its refusal to be pinned down. Each rediscovery sparked fresh debates. Was it truly the burial cloth? How had it survived fires, wars, and centuries of hiding? These questions didn't weaken faith, they made it dynamic. Scholars pored over its linen weave, comparing it to the Shroud of Turin, while poets likened its journeys to the soul's own winding path toward grace. The relic's very instability became its lesson, that some truths aren't meant to be held, only sought. Today, when pilgrims line up in Oviedo's cathedral to glimpse the Sudarium through bulletproof glass, they're participating in a tradition older than the relic itself. They come not just to see, but to wonder, and in that space between certainty and mystery, between the cloth's stark stains and the unanswerable questions they pose, the Sudarium still works its quiet magic, proving that sometimes what's stolen isn't the object, but our complacency, leaving behind a faith that's sharper, hungrier, and infinitely more alive. The hand of Saint Theresa wasn't just a relic, it was a conduit to the divine, a flesh and blood testament to the ecstasies that had once seized the saint as she penned her mystical writings. When anarchist militias looted the Carmelite convent in Ronda during the Spanish Civil War in 1936, tossing the severed hand into a sack of looted church silver, they didn't realize they were setting the stage for one of art history's most unexpected revivals. The hand's eventual recovery, found discarded in a Madrid pawn shop with its wax coating cracked but its eerie serenity intact, became a lightning rod for artists who'd spent years dismissing Baroque spirituality as overwrought theater. Suddenly, they were face to face with something that defied cynicism, a physical fragment of rapture. Sculptors like Juan Martínez Montañez the Younger, who'd built his reputation on sleek modernist forms, found himself haunted by the relic's contradictions. How could something so brutally severed radiate such tranquility? His studio became a laboratory of reinvention as he abandoned angular abstraction for the swirling drapery and parted lips of Counter-Reformation masters. The results were seismic, a series of terracotta studies where saints seemed to tremble on the edge of vision, their fingers curling as if still brushing against heaven. Across Spain, ateliers that had once mimicked Picasso's fractured geometries now raced to master the lost art of polychrome wood, layering gesso and paint until their figures seemed to breathe. Yet the hand's influence reached far beyond technique. Its ordeal stolen, profaned, yet somehow uncorrupted mirrored Spain's own fractured soul in the post-war years. Writers like Camilo José Cela wove its story into novels where faith and brutality collided, while filmmakers framed close-ups of actors' hands clutching rosaries, a silent homage to Theresa's enduring grip on the national imagination. Even the relic scars told a story. The wax applied by 17th-century nuns to preserve it had yellowed like old parchment, turning the saint's skin into a living manuscript of devotion. The greatest irony, the same revolutionary fervor that sought to erase religious art had accidentally purified it. Stripped of its gold reliquaries and velvet cushions, Theresa's hand became raw material for a new kind of sacred art, one that embraced imperfection as proof of authenticity. When the hand finally returned to Ronda in 1941, it wasn't sealed behind glass but displayed on a simple wooden stand, its fingers slightly curled as if still dictating verses to an invisible angel. Pilgrims didn't just venerate it, they sketched it, their pencils tracing the same lines that had once channeled divine fire. The thieves who stole it had hoped to extinguish the past. Instead, they handed Spanish art a future, one where the Baroque's theatricality could dance with modernity's doubt, and where a single severed hand could sculpt the contours of a nation's rebirth. The Viking sword of Ulfbert wasn't just a weapon, it was a whisper from the forge of the gods. When grave robbers plundered Norse burial mounds in the 9th century, wrenching these legendary blades from the hands of long-dead warriors, they didn't just steal steel, they unleashed a cultural avalanche. The sword's disappearance into the black market of medieval Europe should have erased their legacy. Instead, their absence became a blank canvas for saga poets and blacksmiths alike, reigniting a reverence for Norse craftsmanship that would echo through the ages. What made these swords so extraordinary? Their very existence defied medieval metallurgy. Forged from crucible steel, a technique thought unknown in Europe until the Crusades, Ulfbert blades bent without breaking, their edges honed to a lethal sharpness that inspired myths of supernatural origin. When looters scattered them across trading posts from Dublin to Constantinople, the sword's rarity only grew. Soon, skalds wove their legend into epic verses, describing heroes wielding serpents of folded light, their blades singing with the voices of dead smiths. By the time the last original Ulfbert vanished into some mercenary's scabbard, its story had already taken on a life of its own. Yet the sword's true rebirth came from an unlikely source: failure. Blacksmiths across Scandinavia, desperate to replicate the lost techniques, began experimenting with furnace designs and ore purification in ways unseen since the Viking Age. Their imperfect imitations, some bearing misspelled Ulfbert inscriptions, none-the-less pushed medieval metallurgy to new heights. Archaeologists have found these knockoffs as far as Volga River trading posts, each flawed attempt a stepping stone toward rediscovering the original artistry. The thefts hadn't just preserved the sword's legend, they'd turned them into a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down across centuries. But the Ulfbert's journey didn't end at the forge. When Scandinavian nationalism surged in the 19th century, activists seized on the swords as symbols of a glorious, unconquered past. Painters like August Malmström depicted Viking heroes clutching Ulfberts in defiant tableau, while composers like Edvard Grieg scored symphonic poems where brass sections mimicked the clash of these mythic blades. Even the sword's mysterious inscriptions, once just a maker's mark, became political slogans, emblazoned on banners during Norway's push for independence. The very fact that so few originals survived only heightened their power. Like Excalibur pulled from stone, the Ulfbert represented something pure, untainted by time's erosion. Today, when you see a reenactor swing a replica Ulfbert at a Viking festival, or spot its distinctive hilt in a museum's glass case, you're witnessing the afterlife of theft. Those long-ago grave robbers didn't just take swords, they accidentally gifted the future a legend. And in that legend, we find an ironclad truth: Sometimes to keep something alive, you must first lose it, then spend centuries remembering, reinventing, and above all, refusing to let its fire go cold. The Tunic of Argentuil wasn't just a relic. It was a woven silence, a garment so sacred that even its absence could tear open the heavens. When revolutionaries ransacked the Basilica of Saint Denis in 1793, slicing through the seamless robe said to have been worn by Christ during his crucifixion, they didn't just steal cloth. They severed a thread connecting centuries of devotion, leaving artists scrambling to mend the rupture with pigment and passion. What emerged from that act of sacrilege wasn't destruction, but a rebirth, one where romantic painters turned loss into a new language of the divine. Eugène Delacroix, the firebrand of French Romanticism, became the tunic's most unlikely evangelist. His sketches from the 1830s show robed figures clutching at torn fabric against storm-racked skies, their faces twisted in anguish. These weren't biblical scenes, they were contemporary allegories. In his masterpiece, Christ on the Sea of Galilee, the disciples' boat isn't just battling waves. It's adrift in a world where sacred traditions had been shredded like the Argentuil tunic itself. The painting's genius lies in its duality. The robe Christ wears isn't the seamless original, but a patchwork of swirling brushstrokes, as if Delacroix was stitching together a new kind of holiness from the scraps left behind. Yet the tunic's ghost haunted more than canvases. Writers like Victor Hugo wove its legend into novels, comparing its Chinese letter to France's own fractured soul. In Les Miserables, the bishop's silver candlestick stolen, then redeemed, echo the tunic's journey from plunder to parable. Even composers felt its pull. Berlioz's L'Enfance du Christ features a haunting aria where the Virgin Mary sings of weaving a garment sans couture, her voice trembling on the word as if mourning the lost relic. The tunic's absence had become a creative catalyst, its missing threads pulling artists toward bolder, more personal interpretations of faith. The irony. While revolutionaries had sought to erase superstition, their vandalism birthed a more intimate spirituality. Without the physical tunic to venerate, ordinary believers began seeing sacred echoes everywhere, in the seamless shawls of Breton fisherwomen, in the unstitched robes of Provençal shepherds. Folk artists painted ex votos where the tunic reappeared as a ghostly outline over sicks, its form suggested by negative space. The relic's destruction hadn't ended devotion, it had democratized it, turning every hearth into a potential shrine and every homespun cloth into a vessel for the divine. And then came the twist that only history could write. When fragments of the tunic were rediscovered in a Parisian attic in 1842, their return sparked not jubilation but creative dissonance. Pre-Raphaelite painters like William Dyce flocked to sketch the tattered remains, only to reject its literal form in favor of idealized robes in their biblical scenes. The message was clear. The real relic's power now lay in its absence in the space it had cleared for imagination to flourish. Today, when you stand before Delacroix's turbulent skies or hear Berlioz's mournful melodies, you're witnessing the afterlife of a theft that didn't steal beauty, but set it free. The Tunic of Argentuil, torn from its altar, became the loom on which an entire era wove its most transcendent visions. The Iron Crown of Lombardy wasn't just a circlet of metal, it was a band of destiny, forged from a nail said to have come from the true cross and wrapped in the hopes of a fractured people. When Napoleon snatched it from Monza's cathedral in 1805, placing it on his own head in a calculated act of political theater, he didn't just steal a relic. He ripped open an old wound, one that would bleed poetry, music, and revolution until Italy itself rose from the fragments. What made this crown so potent? Its very construction whispered of divine right golden plates hugging that sliver of iron, a physical fusion of earthly power and heavenly sanction. For centuries, it had crowned kings of Lombardy, then Holy Roman emperors, its weight more symbolic than physical. But Napoleon's theft transformed it. Stripped from its altar, the crown became a ghost haunting the Italian imagination. Artists like Francesco Hayes painted allegorical scenes where personified Italia clutched at the empty space above her brow, while poets penned sonnets comparing the missing relic to a severed limb. The crown's absence didn't weaken its power, it turned it into a rallying cry. Then came the twist. After Napoleon's fall, the crown's return in 1815 didn't quiet the unrest it had stirred. Instead, its reappearance ignited the Risorgimento, Italy's unification movement, with unexpected ferocity. Suddenly, medieval history wasn't just academic, it was ammunition. Scholars scoured archives for evidence of the crown's ties to Charlemagne, weaving a narrative of lost unity. Goldsmiths crafted replicas with deliberate imperfections, each flaw a nod to the fractures of the Italian states. Even the crown's display case in Monza became a pilgrimage site, where nationalists would press their foreheads to the glass as if absorbing its ancient charge. But the crown's most enduring legacy pulsed through opera houses. Giuseppe Verdi, the composer who would become the musical voice of unification, threaded the crown's symbolism into his works. In Nabucco, the chorus of Hebrew slaves yearning for homeland, Ava Pensiero, echoed with the same longing Italians felt for their stolen heritage. Stage designers draped choruses in costumes mimicking the crown's gem patterns, while librettists smuggled references to its iron nail into arias about sacrifice. The message was clear: true sovereignty wasn't in crowns, but in the people who remembered them. And here's the beautiful paradox: the more the crown was celebrated as a symbol of unity, the less it needed to exist as an object. By the time Italy unified in 1861, the original Iron Crown was almost secondary. Its real work had happened in the hearts of those who'd never touched it. Today, when visitors crowd Monza's Duomo to glimpse the relic behind its bulletproof glass, they're not just seeing a medieval artifact, they're witnessing the afterlife of a theft that didn't rob Italy of its identity, but gave it a new one forged not in iron or gold, but in the white-hot creativity of a people who turned loss into legend. There's a peculiar alchemy that happens when something sacred is stolen. It doesn't disappear, it multiplies. Take the relics we've explored. Each theft didn't erase their influence but scattered it like seeds in a storm, taking root in places no one expected. Consider the way the Holy Lance's absence birthed 1,000 artistic interpretations, or how the Black Madonna's scars became a canvas for national defiance. These objects weren't just lost, they were liberated from the confines of their physical forms, free to evolve in the collective imagination. What makes this phenomenon so fascinating is the paradox at its core. A relic's power often grows stronger when it's gone. Without the original to venerate, people aren't limited by its reality. They're free to reimagine it, to project their hopes, fears, and identities onto its absence. The Viking sword of Ulfbert, for instance, became more legendary in its vanishing, its myth expanding with every failed attempt to replicate its craftsmanship. The same happened with the Mandillion of Edessa. Its theft didn't end devotion. It forced artists to convey divinity through abstraction, birthing an entire aesthetic tradition. But the most profound impact lies in how these losses reshaped societies. The crown jewels of Scotland, melted down by Cromwell, didn't dissolve Scottish identity, they distilled it. With no crown to rally behind, the people turned to song, poetry, and hidden symbolism, embedding their sovereignty into the very fabric of daily life. Similarly, the stolen sword of Mohammed didn't weaken Islamic artistry. It sharpened it, pushing calligraphers and metalworkers to craft new expressions of faith that transcended the blade's physical form. Why does absence have this effect? Because loss forces creativity. When a relic is present, it's static, a fixed point of reference. But when it's gone, it becomes a question, a challenge. How do we keep this alive? The answers are as varied as the cultures that grappled with them. Some, like the builders of Saint Chapelle, responded with architecture so radiant it became a relic in itself. Others, like the Jacobite poets, spun resistance into verse, turning stolen crowns into immortal symbols. And here's the ultimate irony. Many of these relics, had they remained undisturbed, might have faded into obscurity. It was their theft that cemented their place in history, transforming them from objects of veneration into catalysts for renewal. The Tunic of Argentuil, torn apart by revolutionaries, didn't vanish. It fragmented into 1,000 artistic visions, each piece a testament to the enduring power of belief. The relics we've lost didn't just leave voids. They left blueprints, invitations to rebuild, reimagine, and reclaim what matters most. In the end, their greatest gift wasn't their presence, but the creative fire they ignited in their absence. From stolen crowns to vanished bones, these relics prove that sometimes loss breeds creation. Their thefts didn't just deprive societies, they ignited cultural wildfires, forcing people to rebuild, reimagine, and reclaim what mattered most. Think about it, when a sacred object vanishes, it doesn't just leave an empty space, it leaves a question. How do we keep this alive? And the answers, as we've seen, are as varied as human creativity itself. Some turn to art, like the painters who reimagined Christ's face when the Veil of Veronica disappeared. Others turn to song, like the Scottish bards who wove their stolen crown into ballads of rebellion. And some, like the Goan artisans blending Hindu and Christian styles around St. Francis Xavier's stolen arm, forged entirely new traditions from the fragments left behind. What's truly remarkable is how these losses didn't just inspire, they transformed. The Iron Crown of Lombardy's theft didn't just spark nostalgia for Italy's past, it fueled a unification movement that reshaped a nation. The Buddha's tooth, smuggled back to Sri Lanka in a fisherman's basket, didn't just return to its shrine, it became the heartbeat of a cultural resistance that outlasted colonial rule. These stories reveal a paradox. Sometimes, to truly possess something, you must first lose it. Because it's in the losing that we're forced to ask what it really meant to us, and in the answering, we often find something even greater. So which of these stories resonated with you? Was it the Black Madonna of Czestochowa, whose scars became a mirror for Poland's unbroken spirit? Or the Rosetta Stone, whose theft accidentally unlocked the secrets of an entire civilization? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear which relic's journey stuck with you. And if you enjoyed this dive into history's most transformative thefts, hit that subscribe button for more tales where the past isn't just preserved, it's alive, evolving, and full of surprises. Until next time, remember, the best chapters of history aren't always about what was kept, but what was lost, and the extraordinary worlds that grew in their absence.